This is on, okay. We're good to go? All right, great. Welcome. I'm very glad to have all of you here. I will just tell you, I originally prepared this for a slightly shorter period of time, and in my hotel room just about 20 minutes ago, I said, oh, I've got a lot of extra time to add more cases in. So I did. I added a bunch of more cases in here. Now I probably have too many to present to you, so we'll see how that goes. And how much time do we have? Is it an hour and 45 minutes? Is that right? Okay. Okay, great. Well, anyway, thank you. Welcome here. And it's just so wonderful being back in contact in the desert again. I'm glad we're all here. It's been too long, and I very much have enjoyed, my wife Tracy and I both have enjoyed having a lot of you at our table, just chatting with you, kind of like old times, and it's very nice to be back here. So I'll just give a little bit of a very quick background as to why I'm even doing this lecture. I mean, USOs are, unidentified, submersible objects, water-based UFOs, basically. It's inherently kind of a fascinating issue. I think we're all sort of like, wow, something comes out of the water, goes into the water. But I hadn't really any unusual focus on that. And then about a year ago, on my website, which is Richard Dolan Members, got a very active community of people who are part of that site. And I'll just say, I'm sure some of you are probably here right now, very sharp people. And I get asked questions all the time, and I think it was someone who asked me to describe the, which I'm going to talk about here, the Adak Island UFO encounter of 1945. That was actually investigated some years later by a number of researchers, including Dr. James McDonald, back in the 60s. Anyway, so I looked into the Adak case. It's in the Aleutian Islands, middle of nowhere. And I'd known about it before, but then when you go into a deeper dive, you really look into everything, you think, my God, this is absolutely fascinating. And so that got me kicking off for the next few months on my website, where I ended up doing mini presentations on like a lot of other interesting water-based UFO, USO cases. And then the next thing I knew, it's fall of last year, and I was just into it. I was absolutely fascinated by it. I didn't expect to be taken by it the way that I have been, but it's the truth. And I find it's one of the most fascinating things for me to be researching in the last year. I took a little bit of a break from it last fall when I did a revision of UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. I linked in that book. But then I got back into writing this book here, starting around January, and it's never a good idea to overly publicize a project that you're working on. But here we go. So I've written about 300 pages of this book so far, and polished. It's like ready to go. The crazy thing is that it's maybe halfway done. I'm serious. It's blowing my mind as to how much data there is. And one of the early slides here is going to show you that one of the key gentlemen who were maybe more than anyone else who was involved in putting that together. But so anyway, that's what I've been doing. So my goal has been to review all of the potential water-based USO cases, and then I have to make a decision, like, is this something that I want to include or not? Like, some of the cases are just bare bones from, one or another source that just describes something very innocuous that I read it over and I think, well, I don't really know if I can do anything with that. So I just kind of let it go. Could have been a true USO, but for the purposes of putting together a book or compilation, I want to make the cases good. I want to have some detail in there, obviously. And so a lot just has to get left out. And what's amazing is that despite all that gets left out is the amount that I have. I haven't done a tally of the number of cases that I will include in this compilation, but it will be several hundred USO cases. And it's just quite fascinating from around the world. And then, the other thing is figuring out, like, how far back do good USO cases go? And I will be talking about that with you. So I guess I'll just get started in here. I'm calling this the Forgotten History of USOs. I guess it's forgotten because when you really think about it, how many books or presentations have really been done that try, especially in a comprehensive way, to give a history of this part of the UFO phenomenon? I don't think there's been many. I mean, there's the great classic work from 1970 by Ivan T. Sanderson. I'm sure many of you know this book called Invisible Residents. It's a great book. He starts off with a fake case, actually. That's my opinion now. But everything else about it is a great book, beautifully written. And that really was, I think, the first great one. And then there have been some other good books. I would say most recently, I'm just going to mention this man here. This is the late Carl Feind. Carl only died just in 2019, and he had a book called UFOs and Water, which there's a little image of it there. And he also ran a website which just until recently was still active, but it's now defunct. It's gone, unfortunately, called waterufo.net. And Carl, I met him a couple of times. He's a very highly intelligent man, a very dedicated researcher, and dove into, as it were, the USO cases, water-based cases, more than anybody, including Ivan T. Sanderson, more than anyone I think has ever done. And what Carl did on both in his book, but especially on his now gone website, is he just scavenged up, hoovered up, sucked up all the water-based UFO cases that he felt were worthy, and he included a lot. And for him, if it was a case of a UFO in the rain, that would go in. If it was a case of UFO in the fog, that would go in, or a UFO on snow, that would go in, because his main interest, I feel, was looking at the physical effects of UFOs on water. And in fact, in his book, UFOs and Water, that's really his main focus there, and it's fascinating. It wasn't really my main interest in this. I'm more very traditional. I'm like, I want to know about the objects that are coming out of the water. But Carl really looked at this in a very, I would say, very scientific way. He referenced a lot of the work of the late Paul Hill, a NASA scientist who did a lot of excellent scientific work on this. So Carl was very, very serious about this. But as a result, he did a real service, because he just collected about 1,600 cases of UFOs interacting with water, including many that would be bona fide USOs. So he needs a shout out. His work is, I was doing this book without Carl's database, but it's 10 times better with it. So he did the work, he put it together, and really it's like a newspaper clipping here, an article out of the International UFO Reporter there, and wherever he got it, he put it up there and just pasted it. So what I'm doing is, I rewrite everything. For me, I just want my analysis, my take on all of these cases, so I look at every one, and then I try to just do justice to it and bring it to life. And when this book is done, we're having it illustrated. Going to find a very good, I'm doing the initial drawings of all of them. I'm not a very good artist, but we will have someone who does that, and they will make it, I want to make them all true to the case. So it'll be, I think, very liberally illustrated. But anyways, this is Carl Feind, and his work was very important. There are other people who've done very, very good work on water-based USOs. One is Debbie Ziegelmeyer. I don't know if Debbie's here, but she's been around for a while. She's high level at MUFON, deservedly so. She's a great researcher. She did a book. I think Preston Dennett did a book on his take on the underwater base out by the Channel Islands. But there hasn't been a lot else. There's not a lot of detailed dives, as it were, into this subject. So I thought, I want to do this, and it's coming along well. I'm excited about it, and that is why I'm doing this lecture here. So I'm starting back with a question. When did this USO phenomenon start? Or I guess maybe a better way to look at it is, what is the earliest really good evidence that we have? It turns out that like if you look at ancient sources of this, I'm a big fan of Wonders in the Sky by Chris Aubeck and Jacques Vallée. I like reading that book just a lot, even at night. It's good nighttime reading for me. But they go back through ancient history to record pretty much anything that seems like a halfway decent UFO account, including some water-based ones. And they have a few going back. There's one from China around the 11th century that I looked at. I think is okay. The problem with a lot of the earliest cases when you read them is how they're written. There's no detail of the kind that we today would want. There's no like technical description of what people are looking at. So there's a case of, well, a light came and moved above the water, and then like no one will even say, well, like how did this thing go away, or what happened then, or like there's a lot of missing details on most of these ancient cases, and it's hard to know like what am I reading here. So and I definitely feel this way of ancient UFO cases. I tend to think that the ancient cases are overrated. I know, so sue me. Doesn't mean that I don't think there was an ancient alien phenomenon. I'm not saying that. I do think that we've been observed and interacted with for a long time, but I do think that a lot of those ancient sightings are not nearly as strong as we want to think. And in fact, I'm going to start off with one case here that fits that bill. This is, sometimes you'll find this on websites. It's listed as a USO case from Bristol, England, if you can see that there. It's out on the west side, not far from Wales. And this was a case that was said to have happened in October of 1661. And I'm using this as an educational tool for all of us. So that's the location of where Bristol is. And I'm going to read you the text, because you may not be able to see it here easily anyway. So this was written in 1661, and the person writes, at or near the city of Bristol, about the same month of October 1661, he'd been writing about something else, several persons, to the number of about 15 or 16, having been at a wedding, did, after dinner, walk abroad by the riverside called Severn. Some of them walked upon the bank close by the river, others of them at a greater distance, but they all, as they have since reported, saw a cloud rise up out of the water, much resembling the kites with which the boys are wont to recreate themselves in the fields. That's interesting. They're flying kites in the 1660s. I didn't know that. So, okay, so you're thinking something, by the way, this is, I actually tried to put this together here, so there's some smoke, and who knows what this thing looked like. He's mentioning kites, so you're thinking, all right, so there's maybe angles, it sounds like it's maybe mechanical, like you think that. So he continues, he said, it rose higher and higher, till, as they conceived, it became a direct cloud in its proper region. And as they stood looking up and gazing upon it, they plainly saw the cloud open. All right, now that's weird. The cloud, it's not supposed to open up like this, but let's just keep going. They saw the cloud open, and therein beheld, as they all apprehended, the form and proportion of a tall black man with a thin, meager countenance or expression, right, who seemed to move to and fro, back and forth, very swiftly, and then suddenly vanished. So it's like an apparition. It's not like a UFO case. Let's keep going, because it's not done. He says, and after this, the cloud closed again, and within a very little while, they saw it open the second time. And then there appeared a man on horseback, who moved to and fro with great swiftness for a very short space of time, and soon disappeared, upon which the cloud immediately, as before, was shut up. But presently opening again the third time, there appeared the form of a very comely and beautiful lady, who, after she had for a while moved backwards and forwards, as the other two had done before, vanished also, and then the whole cloud disappeared. So that's the sighting. And, you know, I mean, you read that and you think, well, what do we make of this? How do we interpret this? He finishes, let me just read the last thing here. He says, none of the spectators are in the least suspected to have any inclination to fanaticism, as upon inquiry will be found to be true. Therefore, we doubt not, but upon that account the relation will gain credit amongst those who otherwise are too slow of heart to believe these things. Beautiful writing. A little convoluted writing, but we get it. We get what they're saying. So this is from a book called Mirabilis Annus Secundus. It was published anonymously in 1662. It translates as, well, a couple of things. The second year of prodigies. Better translation is probably an amazing second year or an astonishing second year. What is that second year? Well, when you look into this, you find that there was a lot going on in England in 1661. If you know your English history, some of you probably do, England had just gone through a very massive civil war. And Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, had just died in 1658, shortly before this event. Cromwell, of course, led the parliamentarians, or the Puritans. This was a big deal. This was like a civil war for England, kind of on the scale of the American Civil War for the Americans. Smaller population, but a very high death proportion. It was bloody. It tore family against family, and it was a horrible, horrible thing that the English had gone through, and it went for decades. I mean, it started out when they cut off the head of the king. King Charles I lost his head, I think in 1649, and so it was a crazy time. So that's the backdrop of this. Because in 1658, as I mentioned, Cromwell died. And by 1660, guess what? England had the restoration of the crown. So Charles II was crowned as the King of England. And it turns out that Bristol, by the way, was a very heavily royalist city. So they were very like pro-king. They were not so fond of the parliamentarians or Cromwell's group, the Puritans. So that's the backdrop of this. So now when you look into this, I'm going to give you my interpretation. The tall, black man with a grim countenance, that's the Puritans, moving back and forth. The man on the horseback, that's the dashing cavalier, Charles II, who was in fact a very popular man, a great gallant horseman, as a matter of fact. He was known for this. And then I would say the beautiful lady, it would be peace or, tranquility coming to the island, which was often discussed in the form of a beautiful woman. It was very typical. And so I think what we're seeing here, and what is the second year, the second amazing year? It was the second year of the restoration of the crown, clearly. So what I think we've got here is somebody, some anonymous person, is just writing a story to promote the end of the English Civil War and to say, look, this is a chance for peace to come throughout our society. And so is it a UFO or a USO? I'm going to say my verdict is no. I'm just saying it's not a USO. I wouldn't include that in my book. That was a long, long explication. But I feel like we need to do this in our field because, and I'll leave this here at this, but I do feel that there's a very strong tendency in the UFO research field. We look at these old cases and I don't really think we have a critical eye in terms of the history of the society at the time, what's going on, what are the religious issues, what's the political issues, what is society going on. And you could do this with a lot of just plain old UFO reports from that time period. There's quite a lot. That would also include, in my opinion, a number of Marian apparitions of Virgin Mary. I'm not saying they're all fake. I'm not saying that. But I do just want to suggest that we would do very well to be specific when we are looking at these cases for the historical, social significance, and whatever motivations the writer would have for putting these stories out. And that doesn't inherently make the case fake, but it does make us think we should be a little careful with these, and just before we reflexively say, oh yes, well here's another ancient UFO case, and here's another one, here's another one. They're not all that great. When you really get into it, they're different than what they come across as. So that's what I will say. And so what I guess when I look at some of the earliest USO cases, I'm just not finding a whole lot that makes me just sit up and say, wow, that this blows me away. That starts to happen around this time here. This is a case from 1717 in the Caribbean near Martinique. In fact, I would say of all the early USO cases I've looked at, pardon me, for me, this is the first one chronologically that makes me think I could believe this. This one I can believe. So we're talking about a French ship, and this is, you can see I've got it on a map there. It's on the edge of the Caribbean. I'll just read my notes here. You may not be able to see it in the back. You have a French ship. I don't remember the name of it, if I have it written down somewhere. It's close to Martinique. It's somewhere southwest of that. And he records a hovering object just 2 feet above the water. So it's not in the water, but I think we can count this as a USO. You're out in the middle of basically nowhere. It's 2 a.m., according to the record. And I'm just going to read. It's a frigate. It was called La Valeur. And the author of this report was the Chevalier de Récourt. I don't know who this man was. And this is what he writes in the journal of the ship. He says, at 2 in the morning, we were making some progress in a southeast direction. We saw something like the mast of a ship pass alongside, standing up about 2 feet above the water. That's all we have there. So, but what's nice about it is, like, he's very factual, he's very matter of fact. He's not really trying to make a point. He's not trying to make a political point, not trying to make a religious point, like this is a vision, this is a prodigy. He's not doing that. He's just recording it very straightforward. And you'd wish that there would be a little bit more here. I think I looked up the moon phase. Do I have that? Yeah. So there are astronomical websites you can look up. What was the phase of the moon on such and such a day? And so this was a full half phase of the moon. It had just entered its final phase. So it was half. So I'm thinking there's some decent visibility. It might have been, I don't know if there was a lot of cloud cover. We have no idea. But I look at this as a potential something. I mean, a mast, I'm thinking something that might be vertical, of an orientation, or is it a mast with a flag? He's not telling us a lot, so I don't really know what this thing truly looked like, but he said it was 2 feet above the water at 2 in the morning in the Caribbean. And, let's all face it, in 1717, there's not supposed to be anything doing that in the Caribbean. So I think we can count this as a potential very good USO. This, to me, this is 1825 in the Pacific near Hawaii at 3:30 a.m. This is a British ship. And now this one kind of does blow me away. So we're talking just about 200 years ago. And by the way, I'm not a graphic artist, but I try to put together a lot of these visuals to kind of bring them to life, as it were. So you've got a ship out there, and suddenly this happens at 3:30 in the morning. And I'm going to read to you the account. This was written by a naturalist on board the ship. His name was Andrew Bloxham, and he was on the ship. And he reports at at 3:30 o'clock this morning, so about 3:30 a.m. So they're on the water. And so you imagine 3:30 a.m., it's almost got to be pitch black out there. He said, the middle watch on deck was astonished to find everything around them suddenly illuminated. Turning their eyes eastward, they beheld a large, round, luminous body rising up about 7 degrees, apparently from the water to the clouds, and falling again out of sight. And a second time, rising and falling. It was the color of a red-hot cannon shot and appeared about the size of the sun. It gave so great a light that a pin might be picked up on deck. That's what he wrote. Now that's a great report. That's like you got a lot of detail, and the thing comes up. He said apparently out of the water. Understandable that the first time it's coming up, they're not going to necessarily see it coming out of the water. But of course, where's it going to come? it's where else is it going to be coming from except from below the water? But then they watched it go up and then come down and then rise up and fall a second time. What is that? Well, it turns out I've got another case for you featuring a U.S. aircraft carrier much later that describes an object, and I'll show it to you, that's almost maybe identical to this thing. And it's kind of crazy. Anyway, so that's 1825 near Hawaii. Now I'm going to talk about the pinwheel effect. I bet some of you know about this. Ivan Sanderson wrote about this. Charles Fort, who, of course, a century ago was collecting a lot of these archaic UFO-type anomalies, collected a lot of these pinwheel reports, too. What am I talking about? Well, I'll show you. This, by the way, is a drawing from a U.S. Navy captain, a commander, from 1949 and from the Persian Gulf. And he drew this pinwheel effect that was beneath his ship. But this goes back much earlier than 1949. I'm just going to read you some of these that I just pulled out from different places. So this is, a lot of them are from the Persian Gulf, and a lot of them are from east of the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, the Malacca Strait, which is one of the main shipping choke points of the world then and now, especially now, and also in the South China Sea. So a lot of these are in, like, from Iran to India, past Southeast Asia into the South China Sea, that region. I'll just read you some of these. This one's from the Persian Gulf from 1879. A revolving wheel, so they're watching the water. These are all like captains and officers of various vessels. A revolving wheel with a center on that bearing and whose spokes were illuminated, and looking toward the west, a similar wheel appeared to be revolving, but in the opposite direction. These waves of light extended from the surface well under the water. That's 1879 Persian Gulf. Here's another one, 1880 Persian Gulf. About 11:30 p.m., there suddenly appeared on each side of the ship an enormous luminous wheel whirling round, the spokes of which seemed to brush the ship along. The spokes would be 200 or 300 yards long. Enormous. This is one from the Gulf of Oman, 1906. And there's quite a few others. I'm just giving you some highlights here. This one. Shafts of brilliant light which came sweeping across the ship's bow at a prodigious speed. Yeah, a lot of these are rapidly revolving, which might be put down to anything between 60 and 200 miles an hour. These light bars were about 20 feet apart and most regular. That's 1906, Gulf of Oman. 1907, Malacca Strait. Shafts which seemed to move round a center like the spokes of a wheel and appeared to be about 300 yards long. And then the last one I'll give you here from the South China Sea in 1910, a horizontal wheel turning rapidly, pretty much the same description. You know, when I was reviewing Carl Feit in his book, Water UFO, I don't think he considered these anything other than tectonic activity, some kind of geologic stresses in the ocean causing this phenomenon. I mean, as much as I love and respect his work, I can't find myself agreeing with that. I've never seen any analysis that points to that. I've tried to find out like what geologists actually have to say about this phenomenon. I have not once been able to find any kind of reasonable explanation for this phenomenon. And I don't see any reason to ascribe it to geological anything until I can find some reason to believe it. This is just some crazy stuff. The one that of that image I'll just show you here, which I don't have a slide for that, but Commander J.R. Bodler of, I forget the name of this is a U.S. Navy ship, 1949. He's also in the Persian Gulf, right at the Strait of Hormuz, right where it gets very narrow there. And he said, you know, it was late at night. We saw 3 of these things coming at us. The first 2 especially were absolutely enormous, revolving spokes of light. One came right at our ship, went directly beneath our ship. That's the drawing he made here. And it just passed right through. There was another one about the same size, and then a third, slightly smaller one, but that also was quite large. He had no explanation. He wondered, well, is this some kind of phosphorescence? That is a natural luminescence that does occur in the oceans. But the thing is, what I didn't mention in some of these other cases here is frequently the captains, they were smart guys. They knew what you know, in the 1870s and 1880s about phosphorescence, they would often go over the side of the ship with a bucket and bring the bucket down, bring up the water, and look for phosphorescence. Is there any kind of glowing material? And in all of the cases that I'm looking at here, it was not determined to have any phosphorescence in the water. So what's causing the light? Well, we don't have an answer for it. Charles Fort, though, when he was reviewing these, keep in mind, Fort's writing in like the 1920s. This is decades before Kenneth Arnold, decades before Roswell, before anyone talked about flying saucers. But Fort was a very brave thinker, I would say. And his theory was that, yeah, they came here from out there, they came into the ocean, and they're hanging out down in the ocean. Extraterrestrials. So that was his opinion. And I mean, when you think about it, it's a pretty reasonable hypothesis. But anyway, so that's a little bit about the pinwheels. Now I'm going to get into the Adak Island case. This is the one that started kind of my interest in the last year on this. There's the map. You can see it's the Aleutian Islands there. There's not a lot going on in that part of the world. We're right in between Alaska and Kamchatka, Siberia. It's very cold ocean with a lot of bad weather. This is not a tourist destination. I'm going to predict none of us ever goes to Adak Island. If you were in the U.S. Navy or Air Force, you might have done a couple of months there. And that's how we have some. And by the way, the story, I'm going to give you this one, but I found there are several USO stories from Adak Island over the years, including in the 1960s and 70s, and I think a little bit after that. But we're just going to do this one here. This is a heck of a case. Summer of 1945, we don't have an exact date. And by the way, with a lot of these USO cases, this is what you find. Reason being, a lot of them come from former Navy guys. And you can imagine, something happens when they're on a ship in the service. They don't talk about it right away because you're not supposed to talk about it right away, but then years go by and you find an individual private researcher and you tell your story. And by that time you're like, what was the date on that? Like, they can't remember it all. Like, you got to cut them some slack. So here we are in summer 1945, Adak Island. This is the ship. It's called the USS Delaroff. This is a photograph of it from 1943, so it's probably kind of what it looked like in 1945. And I did a little recreation of this. I think this is James McDonald. He's the researcher who, he wasn't the only one to investigate this case, but he's the most famous one who did so. And he interviewed, it was a radio man on this ship named Robert Crawford. And this is one of the last really good UFO reports of the Second World War. So, summer of 45, Germany has already surrendered. The Pacific War is still continuing. It's getting close to the end, but it's not quite over. So Crawford is on the Delaroff with 14 other crewmen, and they're actually headed back to the United States. They're going back to Seattle, and they're passing by Adak Island. And so this is the story. He says, around sunset in the open sea, an object appeared out of the water about a mile from the ship. Now, to be precise, Crawford did stress, he said, none of us actually saw it exit the water. He said, however, we saw it come straight up. And again, you have to ask, well, all right, so where else is it going to have come from? There's no other place for this to have been based. Anyway, so it comes straight up. He said it was very dark. It was silhouetted against the sunset. We saw it very well. It was circular in shape. He estimated its diameter as about 200 feet. It's pretty big. It's pretty large. He said it went straight up, then made a turn and circled their ship 2 or 3 times. That's interesting. It was interested in them. He said it wasn't going super fast, maybe 100 miles per hour. But what was interesting, he pointed out, is that it had a completely uniform speed and it didn't oscillate. So very ultra steady in its motion around the ship. And that's it. It just circled them a couple of times and then flew off, disappeared. And he said there were a few flashes of light as it left, and that was it. Again, this is one of these stories. You can look for reasons for hoax and fabrication. No one's ever found one. I can't see it at all. It seems to me to be a legitimate sighting, and that's what happened. So I think that's a genuine USO case for sure. That's a little recreation I did. So maybe that's what it looked like, some kind of disk object over the Delaroff, before it flew off. There's a lot of really good Russian and Soviet UFO, USO cases. I've got a couple. I'm going to talk about that here. We all know where the Black Sea is. That's where Crimea is. That's where the war is going on right now. This is a story I'm going to share with you that I firmly believe. And by the way, there has been, for quite a while, been rumors of, there's rumors of alien bases in a lot of the waterways of the planet. One of them is believed by a lot of researchers to be in the Black Sea, somewhere near the center of the Black Sea. That is, at least that's what, I have some writings of 20 years ago from some Ukrainian UFO researchers in that region. And this is what they believe. There are lots of reports of objects over in that area, and it was their belief that there's a base down there. So who knows? Anyway, this is a case from the 1950s. This man here, he looks like a grizzled veteran of World War II because he was. This is a man named Andrei Korsakov, who also happened to be a very eminent linguist and professor. So he was not just a tough guy who fought Germans in the Second World War, which he did, but he was a brilliant man and world known. He was known around the world for his work in linguistics. And he taught at Odessa University in the city of Odessa. So this, I don't know exactly, when you're dealing with Soviet cases and stories, it's a dicey business because first of all, a lot of this stuff was researched, you could say unofficially. Some of it was quietly done officially. Some of it was unofficial and had to be done very kind of off the books, as it were. And it's not clear to me, which is which. This seems to be just one of those cases that floated around. Of course, during Glasnost in the late 1980s and early 90s, and then the breakup of the Soviet Union, a lot of these stories came out. And I think that this is one of them. So Korsakov is talking to a Soviet researcher by the name of Krapiva, and this is what Korsakov said. This is one of these secondhand accounts. But hey, let's just listen to what he has to say. So Korsakov had a friend who was a Soviet Navy officer. He had a lot of friends in the Soviet Navy, just because of his own background. And this officer friend of his had served at the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea. And during the 1950s, we don't have a year, we only have a decade. In the 1950s, this officer had observed and photographed a UFO ascending from behind a battle cruiser in the Black Sea in the 1950s. We don't know where in the Black Sea. I don't know if it was by the Sevastopol base or if it was somewhere in the middle. I have no idea. The officer was under the impression that the object had surfaced from under the Black Sea. Again, he didn't see it come from out. Crazy thing is Korsakov apparently had a photograph of the object, I assume given to him by his friend. Where the hell is the photograph? Wouldn't we all like to see it? Don't know where it is. But that's the story. And, you take it for what it is. Yesterday I gave a lecture on what is missing in our UAP conversation. I'm guessing some of you might have been there. And I was talking about Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who, of course, is the head of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO. And, here's Kirkpatrick talking about we have to have data. We need data integrity. And I was a bit critical of him on the sense because I kept saying, well, you want really the kind of data that you want. You're going to be throwing out basically 99% of all UFO cases of the past, including all like witness testimony. I consider human eyeballs to be a pretty good receptacle for data. We've survived for millions of years using our eyeballs. They've been quite valuable for us, and I think it's a good idea to trust them. But anyhow, having said that, the fact is when we're investigating this case, we don't always have the exact data we want. That's just the fact. It's just not there. So then we have a choice. Do we just throw it all out because it doesn't fit our very exact parameters of data? I'm not saying you just include any wild story because it sounds good. I'm not saying that. We have to use our judgment, obviously, but I think good judgment includes the ability to look at stories just like this and to ask ourselves, does this make sense? To me, it does. To me, it fits. This is a picture of another, one of the leading Soviet researchers back during the 50s and 60s and 70s, Vladimir Azaza. And I don't have a specific case here, but this I think is very interesting. So what he talked about, I think Azaza led this from 76 to 1987, or he was involved in it. A Soviet military group was secretly studying USOs, and several of which involved underwater objects following Soviet submarines. Azaza says, initially we thought they were American devices. And he says, one day, such an object came to the surface in a rather spectacular fashion. One of our icebreakers was working its way in the Arctic Ocean when a brilliant spherical craft suddenly broke through the ice and flew up vertically, showering the vessel with fragments of ice. All of the sailors on deck and the officers on the bridge saw it, and it was hard to deny the hole in the ice. The person asks, was it a missile? Azaza says, you don't shoot a missile that way. You have to break the ice first. Furthermore, the object was a bright sphere. So I just kind of like that 1825 case that I was talking about, and there'll be others. By the way, I didn't include a slide on this. It'll be in my book. I mentioned Ivan Sanderson started his book off with a case that, unfortunately, I don't believe is a true case. And if you remember this book, it's spectacular, and Sanderson's such a good writer. But it was said to have taken place in Antarctica. And I don't have the details at the top of my head here, but essentially there was I think a Chilean or an Argentine scientist, I think a Chilean scientist was on board this American ship and supposedly reported an object just like Azaza describes here, breaking through, I think, 35 or 37 feet of ice, coming up, shocking everyone, and showering the area with blocks of ice, just like is described here. Now, I investigated this one, and I totally accepted that case for years until I read the absolute denial of it by the primary witness, who said, yeah, I learned about this in like 1974, 75. Someone said to me that this guy had written about it, and that is absolutely not what happened. His whole statement is online. You can find it. He said, look, we did see UFOs down in Antarctica, just not this. We were down there. There were a few objects. I don't know what they were. They were interesting. I did report them to NICAP, which was, of course, the great UFO group at the time. And he said they may have been anomalous. I don't know. But the thing about the object coming from under the ice, he said that never happened. So that's what we have. And so I was like, okay. But the reason Sanderson included it's kind of his fault, kind of not his fault. He apparently found it in some popular magazine, which I have not been able to locate. I have tried to find this, from like 1967 or something like that. I think someone just kind of threw this story together based on the sighting report of the witness, and who the heck knows where he got some of the other data from, but he wrote this fabulous article about an object breaking through the ice, and Sanderson obviously read it in that magazine and then just threw it into his book. Started his book off with it, as a matter of fact. So, but does that mean that such a type of thing never happened? Here's Azaza describing basically the same type of thing happening in the Arctic with the Soviets. So, look, I think probably something like this did happen. So there you go. And I did a little recreation here. I'm having fun with the graphics, but anyway, it's like an icebreaker and then maybe an orange thing coming through a hole in the ice. Who knows what it was like? This is another case. This is a very interesting case to me. This is from 1963. This involves the Royal Navy, the British Navy, and somewhere off the coast of Norway. And it was told about 20 years after the fact, when one of the witnesses was living in the United States in New England and met with an American researcher named Walter Webb, who was a very prominent, highly respected UFO researcher at the time. This man, who went under a pseudonym for this story as Tom Preston, that was not his real name, These guys are all afraid. They're all afraid of being found out, of violating security oaths and all of that, and so it's easy to understand. But anyway, so this man became friends with Webb and eventually trusted him with this account, and that Webb then wrote out and reported. So he was a UK Navy lieutenant, and Webb, yes, Webb wrote this in 1984 and said, I consider this man to be very credible. So Tom Preston, pseudonym, says, in 1963, Royal Navy ship, doesn't give the name, in the North Atlantic Ocean, just off the coast of Norway on, quote, non-specific exercises. He's not giving up much. He said his job, he operated the ship's radar and sonar systems. So kind of good place to catch a lot of data. He said the ship's radar suddenly detected an airborne craft, apparently coming out of nowhere. He believed it was coming at a very high speed. No visual confirmation, but other ships in the area, they were not alone, there were other ships, also confirmed the object on their radar. So it then came to a complete stop. It then apparently went below the surface of the water and was gone. Once it was under the water, they were able to track it for a couple of minutes, but it was very fast, and before very long, it was out of range. After this, all the crew was reminded, you have signed the Official Secrets Act, and you must never discuss this event. And Preston also said to Webb that the ship's logbook was replaced with a brand new logbook, a brand new empty logbook. So that's that case. No reason for me to disbelieve it. I think it's certainly true. You got to trust the researchers who investigate these. And, you know, when you get a guy like Walter Webb, who was very, very sophisticated, who knew this man very well, I say, look, if you can't trust this, I don't know what you can. This is maybe a possible recreation of what happened, object going into the water. This was a case I wasn't going to include here, but then I realized I may need a couple more cases. I may not have given myself enough time. This is a fascinating case. This is a ship called the Naviero off the coast of South America. I will say there are many, many, many such USO cases off the coast of South America. In the north part of South America, the southern part of South America, both sides, there's a lot going on there. Particularly this area, which you get down into southern Brazil, northern Argentina, along the Atlantic side, there seems to be a lot of activity. This is a case from July 20, 1967. And I'll just talk a little bit about it. Here you go. It's, I think 20, 30 miles off the coast. And this is an Argentine ship called the Naviero. It belonged to, it's a commercial thing. This is not a military case, an Argentine shipping lines company. So what they reported, this one made the newspapers, by the way. The captain and his officers saw what he called a strange, shining, self-luminous object that paced their ship for 15 minutes. It was under the water. No more than 50 feet away to the right, 50 feet away. You just imagine you're well off the coast. Actually, they're more than 30 miles. I think they're like 100 or 150 miles off the coast. So there's just nothing around. And like 50 feet off the edge of your ship is this thing that's pacing you for 15 minutes. That's kind of amazing. He said it was cigar-shaped and maybe a little over 100 feet long, maybe 110 feet long. Powerful blue and white glow, no noise, no wake in the water. You could think, all right, is this a submarine? Could it be a submarine? Well, they wondered this, but they're like, no, this is not a submarine. There's no sign of a periscope. There's no railing. There's no tower, no superstructure, nothing sticking out. And it had this weird glow. What's going to do that? He said it had a speed of up to 25 knots, pretty fast. Not the world record, but that's a very fast speed at that time, especially. The Naviero was going at 17 knots. I'm wondering, is that all I've got here? No, there's more. So it's pacing the ship, and then that's right, it dives underneath the ship, passed right under the ship. It was pacing it, then it goes down below, and gone. It just vanished at great speed, he said. He saw the glow for a while, or they saw the glow. It was more than one witness. So he's speaking to the Argentine press, Captain says that in 20 years on the water, he's never seen anything like it. Chief officer said, not a whale, not conventional type of submarine. He said, this looked totally different from either of those. In fact, he said, could not possibly have been either of those things. So that was their adamant opinion. So there you go. Let me talk about a few U.S. Navy encounters. There's so many U.S. Navy encounters of USOs. I'll just say, for many years before I wrote my first UFO book, and even after, my main source of income, I was a pretty good writer of professional resumes for job seekers, just so you know. You come into my office, I sit down one-on-one with you, and I'd be a combination of father confessor, clergyman, and hairdresser, because I'd make you look fabulous, all within the boundaries of truth. I did that for thousands of people. But anyway, in that capacity, it's all true, I swear it's true, I met with a lot of military guys, And after a while, I had to find a place for all of my UFO books. So they were right there in my office. If people come into my office, they'd see like about 1,000 UFO books. And it was kind of good because people would say, oh, I see you like aliens. And I'd be like, well, I don't know if like is the right word here, but okay. But then I would get people volunteering like these crazy accounts. Not all military, a lot of just regular people, but some military. And always the best stories, the most crazy ones came from Navy guys. Almost every time. Air Force guys were very tight-lipped. I don't know what the deal is. Was that? They didn't want to lose their wings. They don't want to lose their wings. Yeah, but the Navy guys, you think there's repercussions there. But anyway, most of these guys were retired by the time I got to them anyway. And got some really interesting ones. In fact, one that's not on a slide here, but I might just tell it anyway because it's a hell of a story. But this one's from 1954. This one did not come from one of my resume clients. This one's been out there. And it took place aboard the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. By the way, the FDR, the aircraft carrier, there's a lot of USO cases and UFO cases associated with it, including, which I'm not mentioning here, but 1952 Operation Mainbrace was NATO naval exercises in the North Sea, just 2 years earlier than this, and the FDR was there, and there was intense, incredible UFO encounters during that. But this is a genuine USO encounter I'm going to describe. So we don't know exactly where it was. I've got a very clear idea about when this was, and it was anywhere from January 1954 possibly to the end of February 1954. It's the beginning part of that year. Why do I know that? Because the FDR normally was based in the Mediterranean, but it went in for a refitting, a total overhaul at the beginning of, in January 1954, and to Seattle. So its route was through Gibraltar, down the Atlantic, around, it was too large for the Panama Canal. So it had to go around the tip of South America and then all the way up. So it covered a lot of area in a short period of time. And it was sometime here that it encountered a USO. Don't know where it was. I mean, it could have been any of those parts of the sea. So what the guy wrote, he wrote this into Filer's Files. That's the first place I saw it. I'm a huge fan of the work of George Filer. God bless that man. He's still going. He's still putting it out. Not quite as great as it used to be, but it's still out there. He's still doing what he can. But for many years, George was just taking people's stories, and and this is one of them. So this man is anonymous. He says, although I would like to divulge detailed information to you, I must first think of my family. You hear this a lot. It's understandable. So anyway, this man was an officer, he said, on the FDR. He wasn't just a regular enlisted guy. And what he says is, without stating my position, I will state that we attempted to, and by the way, this is his full statement, so we're going to put the pieces together after we read it. He says, I will state that we attempted to engage the craft with weaponry, and in the 10 minutes of viewing and the 4 minutes of this attempt, it's very exact, the weapons would not allow themselves to be prepared for engagement. We also attempted to prepare launch of aircraft At the conclusion of the event, I was informed of the object when it arrived by a fellow officer who engaged me in conversation concerning the proper procedure in dealing with this type of event. This writing's almost as convoluted as that 17th century writing from England, but it's military. This is what you get. So let's keep going. So this is, again, my little happy recreation of what I think they were looking at. I'm going to describe it. So this is what he sees. This is this object. He describes this as about 100 feet in length, about 100 feet. So not enormous, but not trivial. And he says, at the 14-minute mark, the craft rapidly traveled upward as two small round objects exited the water. So we've got those here. And then he says, at the 21-minute mark, a much larger cigar arrived from directly above the FDR, and the two smaller discs entered the cigar. Here he calls them discs. So I've often wondered, now, are these the same cigar object and it just seems like it's larger because maybe it's closer? Don't know. Don't have a clue. But he seemed to describe them as separate from each other. And then he says, and then the cigar once again departed upward at 23 minutes roughly, and at the 26-minute mark, the cigar returned and dove into the water. I think I have a little bit more here. Yeah, so let me just review some of the things that he says. So he writes, we attempted to engage the craft with weaponry, and in the 10 minutes of viewing, 4 minutes of this attempt, the weapons would not allow themselves to be prepared for engagement. So somehow their own defense system was shut down. Somehow. It just stopped them from being... This is an aircraft carrier. And by the way, the FDR, I think, was the first U.S. aircraft carrier to carry nuclear weapons. It's a very important aircraft carrier. He also says the object acted in an intelligent fashion by rapidly traveling upward, apparently leaving the area. Two small objects exited the water. Very important detail there. So you've got transmedium objects clearly coming from the water into the air. And he says he's very exact with the minutes, too. This guy is really on his game. 7 minutes after the discs exited the water, a much larger craft arrived, 300 feet in diameter, pretty large. And it goes away, then comes back and goes into the water. I mean, to me, that's just some incredible stuff there. You know, there's always people who are going to be skeptical. That's their attitude. Nothing's going to convince them. And maybe this won't convince them, but it convinces me. I will say that. Here's another one from the USS John F. Kennedy from July. This is an exact date here, July 2nd, 1971. There's quite a few cases associated with the USS John F. Kennedy as well. Quite a few. Several that have come to me from members of my website who collect these stories too. I've got a great website, great people there. Some of you are here. And it comes in. But this one came, I think, to George Filer also. And I'll just go over where. So he says we were in the Bermuda Triangle. And they had just been doing some exercises. I'll describe that in a second. I think this is, roughly speaking, where they probably were. So the witness says his job was to monitor. He said there were 8 teletypes in the communication center. Remember, this is 1971. So they had, he said there were 4 for sending, 4 for receiving, and actually there were a couple of other communication systems there as well, and for ship to ship, and all of these other things. Very sophisticated in 1971, I would think. So the time is 8:30 p.m. It's July 2nd, 1971. He said the ship had just finished a long 18-hour flight operation period. It had been going through a kind of testing of its capabilities. I think it's called qual-car. Carrier qualifications, that's what it is. And it was quite involved, and the Kennedy had been going through this for a while. So he said it's 8:30 in the evening, so it's pretty dark at this point. Even in July, it's going to be dark. He was in the comm center when he noticed that the primary teletypes were printing out nonsensical messages. So that shouldn't be. And in fact, he said all of the ship's communications were down. And then he heard someone yelling. I can't remember if he heard it over intercom or directly. I'll have to review the case. He said someone was yelling, "It is God. It's the end of the world." I think that was through a comm, actually. And then a moment later, he goes out with a colleague, and they hear, or he and his colleague hear another voice yelling, "There's something hovering over the ship." So at that point, this guy goes out to look. And this is kind of what he sees. This huge, glowing orange object in the night sky, either directly over or nearly over the USS John F. Kennedy. And he said it was an orange, pulsing, spherical object. He said it was the size of a beach ball held at arm's length. That's really big. You just imagine how big that would be. It made no sound. It gave off a warm light, he said, half the strength of sunlight. They looked at it for 20 seconds before the ship went to battle stations, general quarters. And they stayed on general quarters for about an hour. Communications, during this time, they did not receive any messages. This guy would know that was his job. You imagine, you're on the John F. Kennedy, you got this thing hovering over you, and there's nothing coming in and out on the ship? Well, that's apparently what happened. Radar screens, he learned, he had people in radar said they all were glowing brightly during the event. They tried to send off 2 F-4 Phantom fighters, which were unable to start during the incident. Sound familiar? It's kind of what we heard with the FDR from the 50s. And he said, I don't know this directly, but there was a rumor, the scuttlebutt was that 3 or 4 men in trench coats interviewed key witnesses in the aftermath. They did not interview this guy. He said, I don't really know why they didn't. Maybe they didn't know I was a witness. That was his only, he didn't really know. I think that's all I have on this case. Oh yeah, then as they're getting into port, and he didn't mention the captains of the ship, but I looked it up. I looked up the whole history of this, and it was a man named Ferdinand B. Koch, who was captain of the ship at the time. They were going into, after their car quals in the Caribbean, which had been going on for a while, they were north of that. That's when they had the encounter. And then they had other destinations in Florida and also at Norfolk and also up in Rhode Island, where there's another big naval base there. And I'm not sure. They went to one of these bases, and he said, as we're getting there, the captain goes on the ship's internal telecom system and congratulates them on, doing very well on their testing and all of that. And he said, also, I want to remind you all that certain events that take place aboard a naval combatant ship are classified and should not be discussed with anyone without a need to know. The author of this account, the witness, said, I am sure that he was referring to our massive UFO encounter. So again, it's an incredible thing. It's like this, and we don't know how long that thing was up because the witness only saw it for 20 seconds and he had to go back in, and so he was not able to observe it. We don't know what it actually did after that, but we do have his testimony that there was a total shutdown of communication aboard, again, a major aircraft carrier. You just imagine, like, if information like this were ever to have gotten out to the public, that one of our aircraft carriers was essentially completely disabled for an hour out at sea by an unknown object. Well, that apparently is what happened. I wasn't going to get into this, but we're in California, and I thought I had some time. There is so much USO activity out off the coast here. It's unbelievable. And so I think it's appropriate. Let's just get into some of it. And I don't know if I can even cover all of these in great detail. Most of you guys probably know, what the Channel Islands are and where they are and so forth. Basically off of LA, Santa Barbara, Long Beach. You got Catalina Island and a bunch of the others. So there's a lot of cases from near Catalina Island, actually from Santa Cruz Island, from all of them. But probably Catalina Island, I think, is the most notorious of them. And I'm just going to review some, only a few. So this one is from the 70s. There's cases even earlier, way earlier. This is a little, you could say it's a sketchy case, but I think it's kind of interesting, and I thought, let's include it. So a guy writes in some years later, he says, I was driving, and there was a call-in talk show that I'm listening to. So there's a lot of room for mistakes to be made here in the account, so let's just keep that in mind. Anyway, I'll just go through it quickly. He says the caller had recently left the Navy. He had been a member of a submarine. This is a crazy story, I gotta say. He had been a member of a submarine that was returning from duty in the Pacific in either 1976 or 77. The caller was stationed at the control or command center of the sub. As they approached the naval port at Long Beach, sonar detected, quote, an opening in the continental shelf very near to the Long Beach facility. I don't know if this is a real story or total BS, so I wonder what you guys think here. The opening, he said, was large enough, and the captain asked for permission to explore it. He was told, yes, but you must maintain strict radio contact with Long Beach while you're doing that. So the submarine enters this, it's like in a movie. It goes into the mysterious cavern, like in the abyss, I feel like. And they're going in, and he says it's an immense, huge underwater cavern. The caller who's calling in on this said the sonar soundings indicated it was extremely wide and more than 100 feet high. The sub continued. It was 30 miles east of Los Angeles, under the water, at which point Naval Command Center at Long Beach said, okay, turn around, get back, you have to come back now. You're going too far. The captain did not need to reverse gear, but instead easily turned the sub around inside the cavern. I have no idea how much of a radius he would have needed for that. Not a clue. I've got to think it's large. I mean, I don't really know what to make of this case. I'm just tossing it out here. Crew is told not to discuss the incident. And by the way, I spoke to a gentleman yesterday, I don't know if he's here, I can't tell, who told me explicitly, he said, look, a lot of these UFOs, we make them. We made the Tic Tac. I was like, really? You think we made the Tic Tac? He says, yes, I know we did. Okay, and then he starts showing me a map of all of the naval installations out by San Diego. Yes, very intense, and including major undersea caverns that were there. So I'm going to stay in touch with him. He's a very intelligent man. I mean, he seems like he knows what he's talking about. So I'm not really prepared to dismiss these seemingly crazy cases. Let me just keep going.
Las Vegas, what is that?
What about Las Vegas?
Underwater cavern. The second to the last bullet.
Oh, yeah. So let me just keep going. Right. So the crew's told, you can't discuss the incident. He said the radio program host was speechless. I don't know when this was called in. I have to double check. Oh, okay, well, let me just keep going. So the caller would not give his name or rank, but he swore the story was true. The writer reports a second account that was given to him in 2010 from a former Navy submarine captain about being tasked in 1995 with taking a submarine into an underwater opening in a cavern near Long Beach. So maybe this is the same area. And in this case, this is the second incident, the sub went nearly 300 miles east from Long Beach, almost directly under Las Vegas, and then was ordered back. So that's what you were reading. You're reading ahead there. And was told, or at least understood, that this thing continued past Las Vegas. What's that now? Place a bet? Well, yeah, oh, right, exactly. And was also advised never to discuss his experience, but then, of course, he did. So, yeah, just putting it out there. Here's another one from Santa Barbara from around 1988. Suspected underwater UFO base off the coast there. Again, all the same area. In the hills above Santa Barbara and Montecito on East Mountain Drive, you have an object about 30 miles away, 200 feet altitude. It would become very bright and then dim and change colors. Very pure, non-blinking lights, white, blue, and red. Object moved back and forth very fast. It would stop instantly. And, oh yeah, this, I didn't really describe this well. So they're watching it from Santa Barbara, and they're looking out to Santa Cruz Island. I did a bad job of writing this up. So it was out there, and it was moving back and forth over the water. That's what it was. And it flew a 10 or 20 mile pattern near Santa Cruz Island in 5 seconds, so very fast. After 90 minutes, it climbed at a 45-degree angle and accelerated south-southeast, disappeared faster than a commercial jet. And that was reported to MUFON. 1992 at Catalina Island, June 14th. This was one, I think Debbie Ziegelmeyer reported this as well. You have many witnesses, I think hundreds of witnesses potentially, reporting hundreds of UFOs rising from the, no, not hundreds of witnesses, excuse me, hundreds of UFOs rising from the waters near Catalina Island, hover momentarily, then rapidly accelerate into the sky. Silence, there's no noise associated with it. There were apparently many of these filed reports with police as far away as Malibu. And the reports were forwarded to the U.S. Coast Guard, which did not acknowledge that it did any searches and dismissed many requests to investigate. So, interesting. And now I'm going to talk about probably the craziest, for me, one of the most interesting cases from this area. You see an area, Rancho Palos Verdes there, at Peninsula jutting out. And is this the one? Let me just jump ahead. No, this is also interesting. So let's just do this one. Guy's driving home late on Palos Verdes Drive. It's 1992. Along those cliffs there, I was there once in my life, toward Point Vicente Lighthouse in Palos Verdes. He sees a green glow coming from the cove. He pulls over. He says, half expecting to see a movie being shot. He sees a family of 3 to his left looking down at whatever was in the cove. He looks over the cliff and he sees a flying saucer. He calls to the family. They're not responding to him. They start to leave. They're starting to go down a path that led to the water. And then he said, despite knowing my incredible luck to see what I'm looking at, I said I had an overwhelming feeling of dread, and he got to his car. And he says, though, directly in the exact middle of the cove and hovering 8 feet above the water was a classic saucer-shaped domed craft ringed with green lights no more than 50 yards from me. It was big, at least 40 feet across, domed, and had an unreal skin. The closest thing I could compare it to is a slick, oily puddle. The rainbow colors were dull but prismatic and had a swirling motion. It began to hum, and as it did, the water beneath it began to bubble and steam. So that was the flying saucer that they're looking at. Now I'm going to talk about, this is one of the wildest stories, and it was reported in UFO Magazine. Remember UFO Magazine? I have a lot of the old issues, and I have these issues. Here's what's interesting about this. If you remember the Davis Wilson notes, of course, that were leaked out a couple of years ago, along with that, from the estate of the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell, was another interesting leaked email thread. It didn't get as much attention as the Wilson-Davis notes, but it was interesting, and we can call it the alien autopsy email thread, and it was a conversation. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell was CC'd on all of this. He didn't really participate in this thread, but it involved people like Dr. Hal Puthoff, Dr. Kit Green, Eric Davis, and Robert Bigelow was CC'd on this, and Colm Kelleher was CC'd on it. And here they are, they're discussing the merits of the Ray Santilli alien autopsy video. And when that came out, a bunch of people who hate that video, like, go all over it, and like, how are these stupid people, how could they believe in that? Well, that's a whole other story. First of all, they had good reasons for wondering about that, but that's a whole other story. At the very end of that email thread, Hal Puthoff says to the group, does anyone have the copy of the UFO magazine? He said, I'm trying to remember. It was a Sedge Masters story. We believe that there's a lot of truth to that story. So I remembered reading that thinking, what is he talking about? So I have a huge collection of UFO magazines. I found it. There's three issues. Hal got it basically all right. He remembered it pretty accurately. So this is what happened. So this is in 1998, I think, yeah, 98. So there's a man named Jeffrey Griffith. I believe he's still alive. He doesn't want to talk to anyone. He wrote this story to the MUFON Journal, to Filer's Files, and to UFO Magazine. In the UFO Magazine, he did it under a pseudonym. Pseudonym was Greg Halifax. Turns out, I think Griffith had lived in Halifax for a while. So in the story, and actually part of this, in Filer's Files, he says, 2 friends of mine were driving in a convertible along Palos Verdes Drive. There's no date for this, by the way. He said they saw a large glowing light moving very swiftly underwater from east of Santa Catalina Island towards them. They watched the light surge toward the cliffs below, so it's coming toward the mainland. But then as it got closer, the cliffs blocked their view. They couldn't see it anymore. And then suddenly, his 2 friends, I'm putting that in air quotes because I think he was one of the 2 friends, saw a bright UFO fly up over the edge of the cliff and over their heads, up a ravine. There was a ravine that was cut into a steep slope of the mountain. So this is where it was. There's Catalina Island and coming right to Rancho Palos Verdes where they were. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. They see the light, glowing light coming under the water, and then they lose it, and then this flying saucer goes over their head and goes over this way. So they chase after it. And they're in a sports car, and they're speeding up the road. They're going as high and as fast as they can go. They ran out of road and got out of their car and ran on foot to continue up where they were going. And then very abruptly, they were accosted by at least someone who looked like a policeman. They said he was in an odd uniform. They didn't really describe the specifics of how odd it was. They said there was a police car there, too. So this guy says, what are you doing here? And they said, well, we're chasing after a UFO, apparently. And he said, you are trespassing on private property. You need to leave. And so they left. And then Griffith writes, he said a few weeks later on the same area, his friends were paced by a shiny metallic disc for a little while, I guess, before it took off into the night sky. This is an illustration from UFO Magazine. When Griffith wrote about this under the pseudonym Greg Halifax, they had a bunch of illustrations, and he recounted this story, and that's the illustration. That's really not accurate because the cop would be up on a cliff. The water wouldn't be right there. But anyway, they drew it out. What's really crazy, if you go back to those issues of UFO Mag, I have this, I created it as a PDF. It's free on my website. You go to Richard Dolan Members, you can search out Sedge Masters, find this, download the PDF, you can read the whole thing. What he did, I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but it's just a heck of a story. So if you read the end of the Wilson Davis notes, the very final page, there's a conversation where Davis is asking Wilson about different things and abduction cases and the like. And they mentioned the name Jeffrey Griffith, who's the author of this account, and his friend Mary Elizabeth Elliott. And it turns out Mary Elizabeth Elliott, who I don't know if she's alive. I thought she had passed away, but I'm not actually certain if she has. She was someone important at TRW. And she had access to crash retrieval information that TRW had. This is my understanding. She was someone who knew a lot of things, but I tend to think that she was one of the key witnesses in this account. And I think Jeffrey Griffith, who is an attorney, was either a childhood friend or a close friend of hers. And he might very well have been the other person with her. And so he wrote about this tentatively to a couple of places, included in a fictionalized story called Sedge Masters for UFO Mag. And Sedge Masters, this is just a great story because he talks about a group called Zodiac. And that's the word that is used instead of MJ-12. And I don't know where Jeffrey Griffith got his information. Maybe partly from Mary Elizabeth Elliott, maybe elsewhere. But what this fictionalized series really does is it gives you a very interesting look into the deep military UFO cover-up and interaction with craft and recovery of bodies and all of that. And it's really quite fascinating. So you can download the PDF on my website at richarddolanmembers.com. I have members content there, but there's free content, and this is free content. You just go grab it. A heck of a story. But anyway, all of this took place right at Rancho Palos Verdes, and definitely involved some USO activity. So I wanted to. Let me just read this. This is, I just scanned this right out of the magazine. He said, one odd fact came out in the telephone interview. The officer's patrol car was seen by, he called them students, to be parked behind the officer on the steep slope, even though there were no roads, and they themselves had to abandon their car to climb up the steeply inclined and overgrown mountainside. They described the car as odd, but offered no specifics in the taped phone calls. They followed the officer's orders and left the area. He's fictionalizing some of this for UFO Magazine. So he's got the witnesses as two students, in this case, and so I don't really know, like, is this part true or not? Like that there would have been no easy way for the patrol car, to have gotten where it was. That seems to be their impression, and that everything about it was odd. So he's giving the idea that we're dealing with aliens here. I think this is the impression he's trying to give, whether or not it's true. So that's all I got on that. And there's much more with the area around Catalina Island. Obviously, I mean, the Tic Tac case is not far from there, a little bit south of there, and many, many more. So we'll just have to let that go. By the way, how am I doing with time? So I got about 20 minutes to go? Oh, okay, and till 3:45. Okay, oh, good. This is actually, I'm glad I added these cases because I have many, 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 many more, but this is good. So this one I'm about to describe is another one that was written in, it's not like a Ghana MUFON investigation, but it's very detailed, and there's something about this that I am fascinated by this account. It was reported to a Canadian researcher at the time called Brian Vike. Some of you might remember him. His website was great. It's no longer existing. It was HBCC UFOs, like Houston, British Columbia UFO. Houston, British Columbia it's not like Houston, Texas. It's a tiny little town in British Columbia, and that's where he was based out of. But anyway, Brian Vike, for a good decade or more, was really like one of the most interesting repositories of UFO cases anywhere. And he started out with mostly getting Canadian cases, but then after a while, a lot of Americans were reporting to his website. He was very active, no longer exists anymore, unfortunately. Anyway, this is, I think this was out of Filer's files, and they did a graphic recreation of an object coming out of the water. Well, let's talk about this. This was said to have taken place in Nova Scotia, Canada, February 16, 2008, a place called Cape Breton. And so here's a map. Nova Scotia is along the east coast of North America, of course, and on the northeastern edge, basically, of Nova Scotia. You can see there. A place called Englishtown Ferry is right there, and you zoom on in. Okay, so I tried to figure out where exactly were these people, where did all of this happen? So I think the witnesses were along there, where I've got that indicated, and I believe the location of the UFO would have been kind of in the middle of this little channel. Englishtown Ferry apparently is I've never been there, but it's a nice, pleasant destination, especially in summertime. Very nice to be there. If you like the water, it's beautiful. So these folks reported this from the scene. 2008, iPhones could do this. iPhone had the capability. They reported this at the time to Brian Vikes' website in virtually live time. So that's kind of cool. So this is what they write. They write part of this in the present tense, part of this in the past tense. It gets a little crazy. Said we had pulled over to check the trailer hitch about a half kilometer south of the Englishtown Ferry on the east side of Kelly's Mountain. A large triangle shape with a bluish glow came out of the water about 1 kilometer away at 6:15 p.m. It hovered above the water for 10 seconds and then went straight up. We are now looking up at it. It's about 3,000 feet in the air, and we figure it's about 200 feet long and about 75 feet wide. Two more just like it just came out of the water in the same area and did the same thing as the first, so there are now 3. They started going higher, almost straight up, and then looked like they became one or were flying very close together. It started to go north and started to look like a star in the sky. It got somewhat brighter, and it disappeared about 80 miles north of us within 1 minute. That's the case. Can't check it. How do you fact check it? But you really go into the details here, and you see a lot of specifics that just make me think we're dealing with something that's legitimate. There's a lot of things that didn't need to be put in there. If you're trying to hoax an account, a lot of this stuff I think really didn't need. Like you have 2 more that just came out, and now they seem to become one. This is something that you hear actually from witnesses quite a bit in these cases. So I feel like this is probably a true case. It's not like the same as having a FOIA of a confirmed U.S. military radar return. I agree. But again, my position on these is I think we should be allowed to give ourselves the benefit of using our judgment, best judgment we can, to try to understand what we think these things were. So that's why I'm presenting here. I think this is the last case I'm going to give you here. I mentioned this on my YouTube channel. If you saw that, it might seem familiar to you. This took place in the Gulf of Mexico, just 2017, not long ago, March 21st. And this is a very accurate location. He said it was about 80 miles southeast of New Orleans. That's about where that is. And so this is an oil rig operation we got going here. And this is my recreation of what this guy saw. Let me read this to you. He said, this was written to the National UFO Reporting Center, where Peter Davenport runs that. And Peter spoke to this guy, which he doesn't always do, but he did in this case because he thought this is a very good case. So the guy writes, close to 7 p.m. on March 21st, just before dusk, myself and 4 of the crew members aboard our vessel saw a craft that appeared to be 5 times our 240-foot vessel in length. So it's a little convoluted, but that's well over 1,000 feet long by his estimate. My line of sight was about 1/4 mile from our vessel. There was a rig behind the craft about 1/2 mile. I used this to help gauge the size of the craft. Sighting was approximately 80 miles southeast of New Orleans. He goes on, the scene lasted for about 40 seconds. The craft rose up out of the water, we're in the Gulf of Mexico here, about 40 feet above the water. He said no water was dripping from the craft. Carl Feit, by the way, in his study of UFOs in water, often referred to this effect. And he had some pretty good analyses of that as far as I could tell. Anyway, no water was dripping. He says, within a split second, the craft disappeared at a 30-degree angle into the sky. Again, that's a pretty exact description, right? He said, this is great, speed appeared to be faster than the speed of a light turning on in a room. That always reminds me of the great quote by the young Muhammad Ali. He said, I'm so fast that when I turn off the light to go into bed, I'm in bed before the light's off. But anyway, this was very fast. It took off like instantly. He said within seconds it had disappeared completely. He said, I can say for sure that the craft was dark-colored, oval in shape, and made no sound whatsoever. He said, with as many rigs, there were 2 rigs, he said there has to be more witnesses than just the 4 on our vessel. In fact, Peter Davenport put out a call for more witnesses, but I don't think any others ever came forward. In fact, Peter writes here, as he often does with a good case, he said, we spoke via telephone with this witness, and he seemed to us to be unusually sober-minded. We suspect that he is a very capable and very reliable witness. And that's about all we have on that. But again, heck of a case. These things coming out of the water, taking off. So I'm actually getting toward the end here, but we may have time for some questions if you want. This is some general assessments that I'm offering here. Definitely since the 19th century. Could be earlier. There could be these cases earlier. But definitely, at least in the last 200 years, maybe 300 years, maybe more, there appear to be several hundred genuine reports of mysterious underwater or transmedium objects. I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that there's many more than that. You know, for every UFO we see, you got to wonder how many are not being seen. Realistically, probably many. You know, and especially when you consider how fleeting a typical UFO sighting is. You know, you see it for a few seconds. Sometimes you're just very lucky that you see it. Maybe you're just looking in the right direction. It's there, and then it's gone. And you could just as easily have missed it. Happened to me a couple of times. And I'm sure probably to a few of you. Very, very brief. So I think there's probably been a lot. But I have found several hundred. And I haven't actually done a full tally yet, but it's several hundred. There are many obstacles to getting these reports, particularly when you talk about the Navy and the military. Also, just the remoteness of the ocean. I mean, most of us, we're landlubbers. We're not really out there, out in the water. This covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, right? So there's a lot of water. We're not there most of the time. And I often wondered if you ever have a life form that evolved on a water-based planet, maybe the water is like the best place for them to be. Maybe it's most comfortable for them. Maybe it's safest for a variety of reasons. There could be a lot of good reasons why you would establish your main operations in the depths of the ocean. Just a possibility. There's definitely a lot of military secrecy about USOs, without a doubt. Just the stories that I've gotten personally and the ones that you read that filter in, it's always these guys like 20, 30 years after the fact. I've got to be very careful, but let me tell you this story. I'll tell you as much as I can tell you. And that's what happens, because they're all afraid of getting in trouble. Some of these USOs, in my opinion, they seem to be observing us. They seem to be very interested in us. They're not necessarily interested in starting a fight, but they are observing us, maybe intentionally, maybe accidentally or inadvertently. Their activities are interfering with our own operations, like in some of those Navy vessels that I was talking about. But they are observing. There's one case I could have mentioned from the 1850s that was a rescue attempt. What was the ship that went to find a Northwest Passage through Canada? Anyway, it was a horrible tragedy. They all died there. And there was a rescue attempt in the 1850s, just a couple of years later. And there was a heck of a UFO, USO case. I'm putting that into my book. But in that instance, you got guys on this rickety, well, by our standards, rickety wooden ship in the middle of the Arctic ice up there. And there's this object they described as like a balloon, but what is a balloon going to be doing way up there? Glowing also. That was just right there watching them, or they're watching it. I have to think that's an observation. I got to think that's an intelligence that's like, these humans, they're doing something interesting. They got this crappy little wooden boat, and they're up in the ice looking for a lost ship. Like, that's brave. That's interesting. That's worthy of observation. Maybe that's what they were doing. Anyway, I think a lot of this activity is direct observation of what we are doing. They're able to affect our best technology. They can shut down our F-4 Phantom jets from taking off and engaging them. I think definitely there's strong hints, almost certainties, of undersea bases. I'm going to guess quite a few. I'm going to guess quite a few. And I think that they're part of what seems to me to be an integrated global presence. This is one of the things I was talking about. I've got 5 minutes, 10 minutes, thank you. When I was talking yesterday, like I said, what's missing from our UAP conversation? One of the main things that's missing, other than our history, that's all been siphoned out, but the other thing that's missing is the massive scale of activity of this phenomenon worldwide. It seems to me, I think that we're dealing with tens of thousands of legitimate sightings every year around the world. I am quite convinced that it's in the many tens of thousands. And when you think of it, it's worldwide, so there's a global presence, and then even out of the oceans, and also let's not forget space, and all the other regions of our planet, mountains, deserts, urban areas, suburban areas, rural areas. It's everywhere, everywhere. It's almost too much for us to fathom what is this presence signifying. What are they doing? I've been obsessed, honestly, with thinking about this for a while. When I started researching this decades ago, I didn't spend a lot of time really trying to figure this out. And for obvious reasons, because how far can you get with it? But I can't help it now, and I think about this a lot. I'm trying to come up with scenarios that make sense out of this. So anyway, I think the USO activity is very much part of an integrated global presence of these other beings here. When I talk about this, I've got an intensive workshop on Monday, and that's I was originally just going to cover the relationship such as there is between artificial intelligence and ET, something I've been interested in for more than 20 years. I wrote about ET and AI over 20 years ago. I was kind of really into it. I still am. My workshop on Monday is going to be way more than AI and ET. It's actually, it's that, but it's really about our transhumanist revolution, global revolution, the digitization of the world, a global totalitarian system, if you want to go there. All of that is what's happening now, and what I'm trying to do is understand what do I think the attitude of these other beings is toward what we're going through. Because that's a big reality, and this is a big thing that we're going through. But the USO thing, just to wrap it up here, I think they clearly have incredible capability. They clearly are doing their thing. Some of it has to do with us. Maybe some of it doesn't have to do with us. There's a lot of really amazing things about this planet of ours. The fact that it has life at all is incredible. And I'm not saying there's not a lot of life in the universe, but there may not be a lot of life on most planets, let's face it. A planet like this one, I think, is a prize. And I think that anyone that has the ability to visit this planet would feel that way. And they might very well want to figure out a way how to live here. This isn't just a planet with life. This is a planet that has an unbelievable abundance of life. This could easily have been a planet that just can barely eke out some life forms, right? But no, we've got jungles, forests, we've got everything. Life in the oceans, life all around the equator, life everywhere. All different forms, all that genetic diversity. I got to think this would be a very interesting place for any visitors to want to stay and figure out a way to stay permanently. So that's one thing that I wonder about. I think that's all I've got here. Yeah. So is there time for a question or two? I would love to answer as many as possible. I see you, ma'am, and I'll get you after that, sir. Yes.
I'm just curious. The life under the sea, you assume are visitors from outer space. Do you ever occur to you that maybe they come from under the sea, just like we did?
Yeah. So if you could hear that was a good question. The pinwheel lights effect that were under the sea, we assume that these beings are from outer space, but do they perhaps come from under the sea itself? That's a great question. I don't know. Did they originally come from elsewhere? Are they native to here? Hal Puthoff wrote a paper not long ago on an ultra-terrestrial thesis. That is, are they native Earth species that just evolved way beyond our ability independently of us? It's a good question. Don't know. Don't know the answer to that. There's a question, hand back there. Yes, sir?
In your research in the USO
No, actually. So that took place at the Philadelphia Shipyard in Norfolk, Virginia, in 1943. That's right. So that's the USS Eldridge. And no, I don't have a USO case from that area. I haven't found one yet, anyway. So short answer. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm kind of curious about what you think of the carvings in Chichen Itza, the ones that show the men emerging from the snakes, right?
You're right. Some of the carvings, I think you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and because I've heard a couple lectures and they're talking about comets being the reason we have all this snake, symbology, et cetera. But I'm wondering if people who thought of comets as snakes would also think of a rocket ship coming through the atmosphere as a snake and then men emerge.
That's really interesting. Well, your question and a few other folks I've talked to, I don't know if I want to do this because it's just more work, but to investigate a lot of the ancient archaeological carvings and artworks of particularly the ancient Mexico, South America, where there is a lot of that. And chances are I'm probably going to go do my own little mini dive into that and come up with something. Probably not satisfy anyone, but I'll do my best because I do think it's interesting. I go back and forth on what I think about ancient aliens. I've been on the show many times. I'm totally for it. But as I said earlier, I do think a lot of those cases are overstated. That's just my opinion. Not saying that they're all BS. I don't say that. But yeah, the archaeological stuff and the ancient carvings, I will admit I haven't really studied those enough. So I probably should. We probably have time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir, and then we'll get a couple of others. Yeah.
Real quick, these don't displace any water going in or out.
Question is, do they displace water going in or out? What you find is that the water gets hollowed out somehow. So it's pushed out in a way. There was a case I could have included here from Togo, that's the West African coast, where in 1974, as a French tourist was having a nice romantic evening with a local woman on the beach, and they're doing whatever they're doing on the beach. Who knows? Probably playing some pinochle or bridge. But anyway, it's late at night, and an object comes from the water, and they describe the water going way, like below the craft, the water was going in this dipped bell shape. So the craft was displacing the water, and it caused a mini tidal wave to come to them. It actually, water came in on the shore and slammed into them. He said they had to hang on to a palm tree or something there. But and then also you get cases sometimes of objects under the water causing a bubbling up of the water. So there's some kind of effect that some of these craft have. And what Carl Feit believed is that it has to do with whether or not their field is on or not on at the time. And sometimes it's on, he said, and sometimes it isn't on. And that was his theory. Best I can answer. Any other questions? Very quick. Yes, sir. And then you, sir. Yeah.
That concept, you also want to think about it when these craft are in the air, moving horizon to horizon in a quarter of a second. The air itself becomes concrete. So whatever the problem is with the water or the air getting through it is the same.
It's the same problem. If you didn't hear that in the back, that's an excellent point. And this is what a lot of people wonder about. How does the Tic Tac do what it did? The displacement of the water is no different from displacement of the air, particularly at lower altitudes where you got heavier air pressure. How would a craft just move so rapidly, like instantly across the horizon? It's got to create basically a field around it. I was really into an interview that Jack Sarfati, the crazy, brilliant physicist, gave a couple of years ago on this. He was talking about metamaterials and the Tic Tac UFO. I bet some of you might have seen this interview. And it was very interesting. I don't know if it's true, but he said, displacing, he said what these craft, I think they do is they can create like a space-time bubble around them. He said, we know this theoretically was possible. There's equations of a man named Miguel Alcubierre from the 1990s who kind of did a mathematics of warp drive. He said the problem with that is that the amount of energy to create a warp field around the craft is just too much. We don't have the ability to create it. He said unless with these metamaterials, if the metamaterial is in the craft of this is the skin of the craft. If you can adjust part of the equation, that is, slow down the speed of light, for example, then you don't necessarily need all that energy. And Sarfati said, maybe a AAA battery isn't all you need. So in other words, to change the equation, don't ask me what the equations are, but that's to change the equation to soften the space-time bubble around the craft, to create that field, as it were, he theorized could allow it to actually do all of those things. So through the use of metamaterials. Are we out of time? We are. I'm sorry, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being here. I hope this was interesting.